Beyond the edge of the known world, where the sun scorches the earth and the wind carries ancient voices, there lies a place untouched by time, a realm of silence, solitude, and trial. It is here, in the heart of the wilderness, that the divine met the desolate. And it is here that a lone figure walked, not as a king, nor as a conqueror, but as the Son of Man, preparing to shake the foundations of existence. For 40 days and 40 nights, Jesus of Nazareth journeyed through a barren land where no comfort could be found and no soul dared to follow. In the vast emptiness, the veil between the physical and the spiritual grew thin. Angels watched from the heavens. Shadows stirred beneath the sand. The enemy whispered temptations laced with ancient power. But this was no ordinary fast. This was the forging of destiny, the sacred trial before the storm. Each grain of sand bore witness to a battle not of flesh and blood, but of spirit and truth. Hunger gnawed at the body, but divine purpose burned brighter. In the silence, he heard the voice of the eternal. In the solitude, he faced the darkness within and the darkness beyond. These 40 days were not a retreat, but a rite. Not a moment of weakness, but the rise of eternal strength. This was the preparation for a mission that would turn the world upside down. Here began the path of miracles, sacrifice, and resurrection. Step now into the sacred sands. Witness the struggle, feel the fire, and uncover the divine mystery hidden in the wilderness. Here, in this crucible of fire and wind, began the 40 days. Chapter 1. Into the wastes of dust and flame. The wind howled like a forgotten hymn, rising from the throat of the earth as Jesus stepped beyond the last gnarled tree that clung to the edge of the Jordan. Behind him, the river still shimmered in the light of a waning sun, rippling with the sacred memory of baptism. The voice that had thundered from heaven, "This is my beloved Son," still echoed in the chambers of his spirit. But the warmth of that moment was already beginning to fade. Ahead lay the wilderness, vast, merciless, ancient. This was no ordinary desert. It was a realm untouched by time, older than the pyramids, older than the flood, older even than the fall. Here, the earth bore the scars of celestial wars, and the sands whispered the names of angels long exiled. Dunes rose like petrified waves across a sea without mercy. Canyons sliced the land like open veins, and the sun, high and relentless, scorched the world beneath with the fire of judgment. Each step he took stirred not only the dust, but memory itself, fragments of sorrow, glory, exile, and covenant buried beneath his feet. The rocks seemed to remember Eden, and the wind mourned the garden's loss. No bird sang here, no stream dared sparkle. There was no shade, no rest, no sound save the breath of the desert itself, long, slow, and heavy as eternity. And yet he walked on. His robe, now tugged by the dry wind, bore the dust to the path of prophets. His eyes, fixed not on the horizon, but on something deeper, carried both fire and peace. He was not seeking comfort nor conquest. He came for confrontation, not with beasts or elements, but with the silence between worlds. For this was the battleground chosen by God, not the courts of Caesar, not the halls of temples, but the desolate heart of the earth itself. And he was not alone. Though no man followed, and no companion dared join him, the unseen gathered. Above, veiled in the shimmer of sky, angels hovered in solemn watch. They did not speak. They did not intervene. They waited, ready, reverent, their wings trembling with the memory of their own testing. But far beneath, in the blackened roots of rock and time, something else stirred, something older than language, deeper than hunger. It had slumbered long through the centuries, dreaming of thrones lost and glories fallen. Now it opened eyes not made for light. It stretched limbs that were more shadow than form. And it smiled, not with joy, but recognition. It had waited for this. It had seen him before, not here, not in flesh, but in heaven, blazing with light. Now he came not with armies, but alone, hungry, mortal, breakable. The wasteland tightened around him, as if the desert itself knew who had entered its depths. Jesus walked on, undeterred. He knew the nature of this place. The wilderness was not chaos, it was clarity. In the stripping away of all things, truth was revealed. And truth was what he came to face, to embody, to become. Every grain of sand, every scorched stone, bore witness to his coming. And somewhere between the heat of heaven and the breath of the abyss, the battle had already begun. Chapter 2: The Thirsting Silence. In the realm beyond the hills of dust, where the sky trembles with ancient memory and the sands whisper names long forgotten, there exists no clock, no bell, no moon to guide the passing of time. Out there, time is a beast untamed, measured not in hours but in thirst. The deeper he ventured into the desert of voices, the louder the silence grew, until it roared like a dragon in his ears. 3 days had passed since he had crossed the gate of Withering Sunday. The flask, once brimming with sacred water from the wells of Galmian, now hung empty at his side, its leather cracked by the scorching breath of the dunes. Each step he took sank slightly into the golden dust, which shifted as if alive, watching, waiting. The sun above was merciless, a blazing sentinel with eyes of fire. His tongue had swollen. His lips, once instruments of blessing, were now dry and split like old parchment. And yet, he walked on, for he was not in search of bread or shade, nor the sweet sleep of cool stone caves. No, he sought the furnace of remaking, the hidden chamber of trials spoken of in forbidden scrolls. There it was said, the body is unstitched, the ego scorched, and only the immortal flame of spirit remains. That was his aim, to be reduced so he could be reborn. On the 4th day, something shifted. The winds changed their language. They no longer howled with hunger. They whispered. But these were no earthly whispers. They curled around him like invisible serpents, hissing half-truths and forgotten lullabies. The air shimmered with illusions. At first, they were subtle, shadows in the shape of trees, flickers of green in the corners of his vision. But soon, the mirages grew bold. Vast lakes rippled across the horizon, framed by sapphire mountains. Blossoming orchards stretched out before him, bursting with fruits never named by men. And then came her, the face of the familiar. His mother, as he remembered her in the garden of his youth, stood amid the vision. Her eyes were soft stars, and her arms opened in silent plea. Her lips moved, mouthing words only the heart could hear. Come back. You're not meant for this. The air tasted of childhood, of figs and honey and warm bread. But he did not run. He did not scream or fall to his knees. Instead, he smiled. He smiled, for he knew that these were not demons summoned to destroy him. They were echoes, phantoms of his own longing, peeled from the walls of his soul by the heat. This desert did not tempt, it revealed. It did not deceive, it reflected. And so he welcomed the visions like old friends, even as they dissolved into dust. As the blood-orange sun dipped low behind the jagged cliffs, he came upon a hollow beneath a crumbled spire, once perhaps the tower of a long-dead desert god. There he sat, bones aching, skin stinging, heart alight with quiet fire. The silence thickened, wrapped around him like a cloak woven from the breath of giants. And then the first voice came. It was not a voice made for human ears, nor one that echoed from divine realms. It was something older, something that hummed beneath the world. It emerged not from above, but from below, from the roots of silence itself. You have come far, it murmured without sound. He looked around but saw no one. You thirst for truth, but will you drink it if it burns? He did not answer with words. He closed his eyes and let the question echo through the canyons of his soul. The wind rose once more, this time carrying with its shapes shadow creatures with eyes of ember and wings of ash. They circled him like vultures made of smoke, whispering of comfort, of rest, of surrender. They showed him cities of gold where he would be crowned. They offered power, pleasure, and peace. You could rule, they sang. You could return. You could be worshipped. Just say the word. But he remained silent. For he had not come to rule kingdoms of dust. He had come to set fire to the self. And so he sat through the storm of illusion, unmoved, until the shadows grew weary and the voice faded into stillness. The thirst remained, the pain remained, but deeper than both, so did he. The silence was no longer empty. It had become a gate. Chapter 3. The Shadow Serpent. From the furnace heart of the desert, beneath stones blistered by sun and sand, something ancient stirred, not in haste, not with sound, but with the terrible grace of a dream too old to be remembered. It slithered from the heat-hazed rocks like smoke made flesh. A serpent, yes, but not one born of flesh and fawn. No, this was a creature of thought, of whispering minds and forgotten fears. Its body shimmered like twilight, and its eyes were not eyes at all, but infinite mirrors, reflecting everything he had been and everything he might yet become. It bore no crown of horns, no scepter of flame. There was no roar, no trembling earth to herald its coming. Only silence, the kind that wraps around the soul like a cold breath and waits. "You hunger," it hissed, though its mouth did not move. Its voice came from within and around, coiling into his thoughts like vines of shadow. "Turn these stones into bread. Speak the word and feast." At his feet, the stone lay gray and lifeless, jagged like the ribs of a buried beast. His eyes moved to it, slowly, and then back to the serpent. There was no fear in him, only stillness, like the center of storm. "Man shall not live by bread alone," he said, and his voice was like a blade through fog, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. The serpent's tongue flickered, not for taste, but for truth. It coiled tighter, its long form wrapping around a pillar of stone as though it meant to squeeze the sky itself. "Are you so certain?" it asked, its grin stretching like a knife. "You bleed, you thirst, and still you chase ghosts. Even the stars above you fade. Where is this God whose words you savor? Where is this mouth from which truth flows?" But he did not speak again. He did not need to, for in his silence, mountains bowed. In his breath, fire rested. The serpent narrowed its mirrored eyes, and in them danced 1,000 lifetimes he had not lived. Kingdoms he could rule, temples he could build, crowds he could feed with a thought. It offered him the world, not with gold, but with subtle suggestion, with the language of lack. And then, like smoke scattering before wind, it vanished, leaving behind no footprints, no scent, only a faint vibration in the air, as if a question had been asked but never answered. The sun fell, dragging crimson fire across the heavens. Darkness cloaked the desert in shades of blue and shadow, and the stars, those faithful fires, fell silent, as if even they held their breath, waiting for what would come next. That night he did not sleep. He sat beneath a spire of bone-white rock, eyes open, watching the sky. And though he was alone, he knew the battle had only begun. For the desert was not just a place. It was a gate, and he had only stepped through its threshold. Chapter 4. Visions from the Pinnacle. On the 7th day, the desert breathed its endless sigh, a vast, silent expanse that stretched beyond time and reason. There, upon the ground, he lay, a figure of flesh and bone, weary and worn. His body ached, beaten by the harshness of the wilderness, but his spirit burned brighter than the midday sun. In the stillness of the desert, he slept, but even in sleep his soul did not rest. In dreams, he was lifted from the earth, rising higher and higher. The winds of the heavens caught him, swirling around his body like wings, bearing him above the cities of men, above the towers of forgotten kingdoms, above temples of gold whose names had long been lost to time. The world below was but a distant memory, a tapestry of illusions, as he ascended to the pinnacle of the holy place, a mountain of light that pierced the heavens. At the peak of this sacred mountain, he stood, his feet not touching the ground but hovering above it, as if he were not of this world at all. The winds whispered around him, ancient and wise, caressing his skin like the touch of 1,000 forgotten souls. The earth was far below, and the stars seemed to bend toward him, as though he were the very center of the universe. And there, in the vast silence of a dream, a voice came, a voice like no other, both tender and terrible, wrapped in beauty. It was the same voice that had slithered through the desert sands, but now it was different, almost sweet. "Throw yourself down," it whispered, its tone smooth as honey. "For the angels will catch you. It is written, the heavens themselves will bear you, and the world will see your power. You need not suffer. You need not wait. Just leap, and all will be as you desire." The words wrapped around him like a velvet chain, tempting him with promises of glory, of adoration, of effortless power. It was the ultimate test. Could he not take the kingdom without the cross? Could he not be lifted to the heights without first descending to the depths? But even in the stillness of his sleep, in the heart of this vision, Jesus' voice rang out, clear and strong, a force of will that transcended dreams. "You shall not tempt the Lord your God," he declared, even as he stood upon that pinnacle of beauty and deceit. The voice faltered, and for the briefest moment, time seemed to hold its breath. The vision wavered, as if the very fabric of reality had been stretched to its limits. Then, with a sound like the shattering of glass, the dream shattered, splintering into 1,000 pieces, scattering like stardust in the dark expanse of the night. The world returned. The dream was gone, and he was back upon the earth, upon the hard, unyielding ground of the desert. Morning came, sharp and cold, its rays slicing through the veil of darkness with ruthless precision. The world seemed just as it had been, silent, waiting, empty. But he was different. Though his body remained frail, his spirit burned with a light that could not be extinguished. It was a fire that no desert wind could smother, no shadow could reach. He rose, not as a man, but as one who had touched the divine. And as he stood, the horizon stretched out before him, the desert vast and untamed. The trials of the wilderness had only begun to reveal their true nature. For the greatest temptations were not the ones that came from without, but the ones that rose from within. Chapter 5. The Stones Remembered. On the 10th day, as the relentless sun dipped lower into the sky, casting long shadows over the vast desert, he wandered into a place forgotten by both time and man. A valley of bones and ancient stones lay before him, half buried in sand, their surfaces worn and cracked, bearing the weight of forgotten ages. The air here was thick with the scent of dust and the memory of past sacrifices. This was no ordinary place. Legends, whispered in hushed tones by the winds, spoke of fallen kings who had sought refuge here, hiding from the wrath of gods long gone. Altars of broken stone stood like silent sentinels, their surfaces still stained with the blood of gods who had been forsaken. Once, these stones had borne idols of great power, figures carved from the very rock, gods and kings who had ruled in their time, now reduced to nothing more than dust and shadow. As Jesus walked among them, his footsteps echoed in the stillness, a sound that seemed too loud for such a place. Yet he did not falter. His eyes, like twin pools of deep wisdom, scanned the ruins with quiet reverence. There was no fear in him, no hesitation. He was not here to bow to the remnants of dead kings, nor to mourn the crumbling relics of ancient worship. He was here for something greater, something more profound. He approached one of the cracked altars, its once grand surface now chipped and worn by the passing of millennia. His fingers brushed the cold stone, and as he did, something extraordinary happened. The stone, ancient and weathered, began to crumble beneath his touch, not by force, but by the mere presence of his hand. It was as if the stone itself recognized him, as if the very memory of what had once been held in its grain now sought release. The idols that had once stood in defiance of heaven and earth dissolved into dust, the air heavy with their passing. It was not an act of destruction. No fire raged, no storm howled in fury. It was an act of reclamation. He had come not to destroy, but to restore, not to cast down, but to redeem. The stones, ancient and forgotten, remembered who they once were, their true purpose, their connection to the divine. And in that moment, as they crumbled away, they were freed from the weight of their past. The wind, which had been silent until now, stirred. At first, it was just a faint breath, barely enough to stir the sand at his feet. But as he stood there, surrounded by the echoes of the past, the wind began to grow stronger. It shifted direction, sweeping through the valley with a renewed purpose, as though it too were awakening. The air hummed with a strange energy, an energy that seemed to pulse through the stones and the bones that lay scattered upon the ground. In that moment, the valley itself seemed to come alive. The stones, though broken, held memories of kings, of gods, of empires lost to time. And now, as Jesus stood among them, those memories were stirred once again, not with the power to reign over men, but with the power to be set free. The stones did not weep, but they groaned, as if sighing in relief, finally released from the burden of their past. The wind whispered, not with words, but with something deeper, something older. It was a voice that carried the weight of ages, a voice that spoke not to the ear, but to the soul. "You have come," it seemed to say, "and now we remember." And as the last of the stones crumbled to dust, the valley was silent once more, its secrets laid bare, its ancient power no longer bound by the shackles of forgotten kings. The wind, now calm, carried the faintest trace of a new beginning. Jesus turned, his spirit renewed, his purpose clearer than ever. The wilderness was not just a place of testing. It was a place of transformation. And he had come to transform it all. Chapter 6, The Dust of Kings. The 11th dawn broke in a vibrant red, as though the very sky bore the scars of ancient battles. A storm brewed on the horizon, coiling like the breath of a dragon, its rumblings distant but unmistakably nearing with an inevitable fury. Jesus stood atop a jagged ridge, where once kings had cried out for mercy, where armies had marched and empires crumbled into sand. The winds howled as if the land itself mourned the passing of ages long gone. He gazed upon the valley below, now empty, the echoes of mighty civilizations long faded into the winds. The ancient monuments, their once imposing structures now in ruin, whispered secrets carried by the shifting breeze, as though still remembering the voices that had once reverberated across the land. Nothing remained but desolation. Yet Jesus felt neither sorrow, nor fear, nor hesitation. He knew that all that had once been here was fleeting, nothing more than a shadow in the vastness of time. Then the voice came again, not as the serpent's whisper, nor as a dream, but as a figure draped in shadows, a king whose crown was woven from smoke. His presence was a manifestation of everything that once was, a reminder of all that had been lost. The air grew thick with the weight of his power, his words heavy like the chains of forgotten dynasties. "All this I will give you," the shadowed king declared, his hand sweeping over the vast ruins, gesturing to the remnants of empires that had long since fallen to dust. "If you will bow before me." The temptation was immense, as vast as the lands before him, as ancient as the kingdoms that once ruled them. But Jesus did not falter. His heart burned with an unyielding flame, a fire that no earthly power could ever extinguish. He knew that his purpose was not bound by kingdoms, nor by the fleeting glories of mortal men. He looked upon the shadowed king with unshaken resolve, his eyes alight with a fire that no crown could match. "You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve," Jesus replied, his voice unwavering, a testament to the strength of his spirit. For a moment, the world held its breath. The storm raged in the distance, but everything around them seemed to pause, as if awaiting the outcome of this celestial battle. And then, with a sound like the breaking of glass, the crown of the shadowed king fell to the earth, disintegrating into nothingness. His figure, once towering, was consumed by the winds that howled in the valley, and in an instant, all that remained of him was a puff of smoke, vanishing into the ether. And still Jesus stood. The wind howled around him, but he did not move. The The storm continued to brew, yet he was unshaken. The shadow of the false king had been swept away, and in its place stood only the vast, silent expanse of the world, an expanse that would never bend to the will of power or domination. He remained firm, a beacon of light amid the swirling darkness, knowing that his true strength came not from kingdoms or thrones, but from the eternal, unbreakable truth that lived within him. The valley of fallen kings now stood silent, its once glorious ruins reduced to dust, and with it, the echoes of empires long forgotten. But Jesus remained steadfast in his purpose. The storm raged on in the distance, but he knew that the victory had already been won. The winds carried away the dust of the kings, and in their place, only the breath of truth lingered. Chapter 7. The Night of Beasts. By the 13th night, the desert, which had borne witness to his trials, gave way to the creatures of legend. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as though the world itself held its breath in anticipation. From the depths of long-forgotten dens and hollowed caves, they emerged, their eyes gleaming like the faintest stars in the dark. Beasts of fangs and claws, their forms shadowed and sinewy, slid silently into the vast expanse around him. But these were not ordinary creatures. They were not drawn by the scent of blood or the promise of a feast. No, they came for something else, a presence, a peace so profound it rippled through the very air, so potent that even the wildest hearts could not ignore it. It was not the kind of peace that could be broken by violence, nor the kind that could be bought by kingdoms. It was the peace of the soul, a stillness that spoke not to the hunger of the flesh, but to the hunger of the spirit. The beasts circled him, their movements deliberate, fluid, like shadows weaving in and out of the moonlight. Lions, their manes as golden as the desert sands, stalked silently with regal precision. Jackals, cunning and sleek, flitted on the edges of the circle, their eyes bright with a knowing, ancient intelligence. Wolves padded forward, their gazes piercing the silence with a quiet, primal understanding. Owls perched on craggy rocks, their feathers blending into the shadows, watching with unblinking eyes as if they, too, were participants in the sacred moment. Yet despite their predatory natures, despite the raw power that pulsed beneath their fur, not one of these creatures moved to strike. Not one lunged or growled or made any sound of aggression. No, they stood still, quiet as the night itself, their every breath in harmony with the stillness of the world around them. They watched him, not with hunger, but with something far deeper, a reverence, an awe that transcended the laws of nature. In that moment, predator and prey alike shared in the sacred silence of the desert night. The boundaries that once defined them, of hunter and hunted, of life and death, disappeared into the vastness of the desert, leaving only the unity of existence. They knelt before him, not as creatures of instinct, but as souls in the presence of the divine, recognizing in him something far beyond the realm of survival, of dominance, of conflict. He stood, untouched, his heart untroubled by the proximity of these wild forces, for he feared neither death nor dominion. His spirit, bound by no earthly law, pulsed with the eternal truth that neither beast nor man could understand fully, but all felt instinctively. It was the truth of a peace that was not of this world, a peace that could not be broken, a peace that even the fiercest creatures of the wild must bow to. And as the night stretched on, the silence deepened. There were no sounds of growls or howls, no cries of terror or hunger, just the steady breath of the beasts, inhaling the same sacred air that surrounded him. They listened, each one attuned to the vibrations of something ancient, something pure, that echoed through the desert winds. When morning's first light finally broke the stillness, the beasts were gone, vanished as silently as they had come. The desert floor, once trembling beneath the weight of their presence, now lay undisturbed. Only their prints remained, footprints in the sand that marked their passing like an offering, a sign of their reverence. And so, the night of beasts passed, leaving behind not a trace of fear, but an everlasting impression of unity, of peace. The one who stood undisturbed in the face of such primal forces had not been changed by the night. But perhaps, in their hearts, the beasts too had been transformed, awakened to the truth that in the presence of the divine, all creatures find a common ground, a shared silence, and a mutual understanding. As the sun rose over the desert, the world returned to its natural rhythm. But the memory of that night would linger long in the winds, carried through the vast, empty spaces of the desert, an eternal testament to the power of peace and to the one who walks untouched by the shadows of the world. Chapter 8. The Well Beneath the Sand. On the 15th day, when the sun had taken its toll on the barren land and the weight of the desert pressed upon his shoulders, Jesus found himself drawn to a hollow in the earth. It was a place where the wind whispered through the cracks in the ground, and the very air seemed to hum with an ancient secret, as though the earth itself was singing a soft, timeless lullaby. It was a song so subtle, so quiet, that only those with eyes to see and ears to hear could truly understand the message it carried. The hollow was not deep, nor grand in its appearance, but there was a presence here that defied the harshness of the surrounding desert. Here, beneath layers of stone and the sands of forgotten ages, something waited, something ancient and yet so very alive. As Jesus knelt, the ground beneath him seemed to pulse with life. His fingers brushed the surface of the sand, and in that simple touch, the earth responded, not with the harshness of stone or the emptiness of the desert, but with something far more profound. From deep within the hollow, hidden for eons, a well began to stir. It was as though the earth itself had been waiting for this moment, waiting for his presence to awaken it. Water began to rise, clear, pure, and as flawless as crystal. It flowed effortlessly, a shimmering stream emerging from the depths of time, untouched by the decay that had ravaged everything else in this barren place. It was not summoned by force, nor by any great display of power. No, this water was drawn forth by a presence, a quiet, yet powerful reminder that even in the most desolate of places, life could still endure, life could still thrive. Jesus bent low, the cool water slipping into his cupped hands, and he drank. But it was not for the needs of his body. It was not to satisfy the hunger of flesh worn thin by the trials of the desert. No, he drank to remember the promise that had been given long ago, that even in the deepest desolation, life still abides. Even in the driest of deserts, when a world seems to have forgotten the taste of water, the earth remembers. It remembers the promise that, though all things may wither, there is always a well of life waiting to be found, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be awakened. As he rose, wiping the remnants of the water from his hands, the wind stirred once more. It was gentler now, the whispers no longer carrying the weight of temptation, but the quiet strain of a question. A test. Do you still walk forward? The wind asked softly, knowing the cross awaits. The words, though spoken by no human voice, pierced the air like a challenge, echoing across the barren landscape. The question was not one of doubt, but of resolve. A reminder that the journey he walked would not be one of ease, that his path was set, and that what lay ahead was both inevitable and unchangeable. Jesus did not falter. His heart was steady, his mind unwavering. Without hesitation, he whispered in return, his voice carrying the weight of all that he had endured and all that he would yet face. Yes. In that single word, he affirmed his commitment, not just to the journey ahead, but to the promise he carried, the promise of redemption, of life restored, and of the kingdom that would come. He knew the cross awaited. He knew the suffering that would follow. But in that quiet moment, in the presence of the well beneath the sand, he also knew that life, in its truest form, could never be extinguished. The wind stirred again, but this time it did not question. It simply carried the whisper of his answer, echoing it through the desert, across the stones and the sands, a reminder to all who would listen that even in the darkest of moments, even when the path ahead seems impossible, there is always a well of life to draw from. a well hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the touch of presence to awaken it. And so, Jesus continued forward, the promise of the well beneath the sand lingering in his heart, his steps sure and steady, knowing that his journey was not just one of trials, but one of purpose. Chapter 9. The Mountain of Silence. The 20th day arrived, and the barren desert seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Yet in the distance, a presence called to him, a towering mountain, jagged and imposing, its peak lost in the clouds above. It was the tallest of them all, an ancient sentinel of stone, piercing the very sky with its sharp, unwavering presence. The wind howled around its base, as though the mountain itself whispered of ancient truths long forgotten by man. It stood as the only challenge to the horizon, and Jesus, with unwavering resolve, turned toward it. He approached the base of the mountain, not with fear or doubt, but with an understanding that this was the next step of his journey. He did not climb for glory, nor for spectacle. There was no desire for an audience, no thirst for recognition. His path was one of solitude, a path that led him to a deeper place beyond words, beyond thought. And so he began his ascent. The climb was grueling. The stone was unforgiving, sharp in places and slick with the desert's heat. Yet Jesus moved with purpose, each step deliberate, each movement a prayer. The mountain seemed to test him, pushing him to the limits of his physical strength. But it was not his body that he sought to conquer. It was his mind, his spirit, his connection to the eternal stillness that dwells beyond all worldly concerns. For 3 days he climbed. Day turned to night, and night turned to day, but still he ascended, his heart steady, his thoughts quiet. The air grew thinner, the winds colder, and the weight of the world seemed to press heavier upon him. Yet with every step, he felt closer to something, closer to the place where words cease and only presence remains. On the 3rd day, he reached the summit. The peak of the mountain was not a place of grandeur or beauty as the world would understand it. There were no majestic views, no applause or fanfare to greet him. There was only the vast expanse of the desert stretching out below, silent and endless, as if the world itself had been swallowed by the silence of the mountain. The clouds swirled around him, like the breath of the heavens, but the noise of the world had long since faded into oblivion. There at the summit he sat. His body, weary from the climb, rested upon the ancient stone. But it was not the stone that held him. It was the stillness that enveloped him, that surrounded him on every side. It was a stillness unlike any he had ever known, a silence so profound, so complete, that it seemed to echo within the very fabric of existence. The silence sat with him. It was not empty, not void, as some might imagine. It was full of knowing, full of presence, full of peace. It was not the silence of an abandoned place, but the silence of a sanctuary. It was the silence of the divine, the silence that exists before and after all words, thoughts, and actions. It was the silence of the soul, the silence that speaks when everything else falls away. No voice came to disturb the peace. No vision appeared before his eyes. There were no temptations, no challenges, no distractions. The world below, the desert, the distant lands, the people he had known, they all faded into nothingness. There was only the mountain, the sky, and the silence. And in that silence he breathed. His breath matched the breath of God, slow and steady, in perfect harmony with the rhythm of the universe. It was a breath that carried the weight of eternity, the breath of creation itself. With each inhale, he drew in the stillness, and with each exhale, he released all that was not needed. There was no thought of the past, no worry for the future. There was only the present moment, infinite and eternal. In that sacred place, he knew that the journey had not been about the climb, nor about the trials he had faced. The journey was the silence itself. It was the silence that speaks without words, that heals without touch, that teaches without lessons. It was the silence that connects all things, the silence that binds the heavens and the earth, the the silence that is the source of all creation. And as he sat upon that summit, alone yet never more complete, he understood that this silence was his true home. Not the world below, not the crowds, not the temples or the kings. It was here in the silence that he found his peace, his purpose, and his God. The mountain, the stone, the silence, they were all one, and he was part of them. The world might continue to turn, the desert might shift, but here, in this moment, he was whole. And he knew that this silence would follow him, wherever he went, for it was not of the world. It was of the divine, and nothing in this world could take it away. Chapter 10, The Mirror of Light. On the 25th day, something extraordinary happened in the desert. It wasn't the earth that cracked, nor the sky that thundered with the arrival of some celestial force. No, it was the very fabric of illusion that began to shatter. The desert, with all its endless stretch and barren simplicity, suddenly became something else entirely. A veil was lifted, revealing a deeper truth. The winds, which had once howled and stirred the sands into restless whirlwinds, ceased. The oppressive heat of the sun faded, leaving a strange stillness that wrapped the world in its silent embrace. And in this stillness, something remarkable occurred. The skies themselves began to shift, not in the way clouds drift lazily across the sky, but in a profound, transformative way. The heavens opened, revealing not a distant realm, but something far closer, something that existed outside the limits of time and space. Before him, standing as though conjured from the very air, stood a figure. But it was not a man, not a being of flesh and bone. No, it was something greater, something infinite. It was a figure made of light, radiant and consuming, yet gentle, as if it was both everywhere and nowhere at once. This was not the figure of man, nor the image of a god in any form he had known. This was Christ, but not as he had seen him before. This was Christ beyond time, beyond understanding, a reflection of the divine, of all that was and all that would ever be. The figure's eyes, deep, endless pools of fire and ocean, gazed upon him. The intensity of those eyes was not that of judgment, nor of fear, but of knowing. A knowing that reached into the very core of his being, speaking truths that no tongue could articulate. They were eyes that had seen the beginning of creation and would witness its end. They were eyes that knew every soul, every star, every heartbeat. They were the eyes of eternity. For a moment, there was no sound, no movement. Time itself seemed to freeze, as if the universe had paused in reverence. Jesus stood before the figure, and yet they were not two separate beings. They were not divided in any way. They were one, whole, united, infinite. The separation that had once existed between the mortal and the divine, between man and God, between Jesus and Christ, dissolved completely. There was no longer any need for words, for actions, or for explanations. There was only the truth of their union, a truth that transcended all understanding. And in this moment, a smile spread across Jesus' face. It was not a smile of surprise, nor of joy as men know it, but a smile of recognition. For in the presence of this figure, he remembered the flesh that had been burdened by hunger, by thirst, by fatigue, and by temptation, suddenly remembered what the soul had always known. He was not just a man walking through the desert. He was the mirror of the eternal, the reflection of the divine, and in this moment, the eternal stood revealed before him. He did not speak. The silence between them was not one of emptiness, but of deep, profound communion. It was a silence that held the weight of all creation, and yet, in that silence, everything was said. There was no need for words, for they were not two separate beings speaking to each other. They were one. The essence of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit resided within both, and in that shared stillness, the mysteries of existence, of creation, of salvation, and of love were made known. He did not move. There was no need for movement, for he had already moved beyond the need for action. His being was enough. He simply stood there, rooted in the light, in the truth of who he was. in that light, the boundaries between the physical and the spiritual, between the seen and the unseen, between the past, present, and future vanished. There was no distinction between what was and what would be, because in that moment, all was now. And in that stillness, in the face of the eternal Christ, he simply knew. He knew that this was the truth of his purpose, his identity, and his mission. He knew that he was both the reflection and the source of the divine. He knew that the desert had not been a place of punishment, but a place of revelation, a place where the deepest truths were revealed, not through knowledge, but through presence. He knew that he had always been, and would always be, part of this divine whole. He was not separate from the eternal. He was, in fact, the eternal manifest in flesh, in light, and in word. And as the desert stood still around him, as the figure of Christ burned bright before him, he knew with perfect clarity that there was no return to the way things had been. There was only forward, only the path that led deeper into the light. The desert had been the crucible, but now the transformation was complete. The mirror of the eternal had been held up to him, and he had gazed into it, seeing himself reflected in the face of God. Chapter 11. The Garden Without Roots. On the 27th day, as the desert sun began to sink low in the sky, casting long shadows across the barren expanse, Jesus came upon a canyon unlike any he had crossed before. It seemed to stretch infinitely ahead of him, its walls towering high, etched by the hands of time and wind. Yet, in the heart of this canyon, something impossible bloomed. The air was thick with the scent of something both foreign and familiar, as if the very atmosphere had been imbued with a memory long forgotten. For here, in a place where no rain had fallen for centuries, a garden flourished, alive with colors and fragrances that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Vines, lush and heavy with fruit, wound their way around ancient, crumbling stones. Their tendrils reached out like eager hands, offering their sweet treasures, their flesh bursting with ripeness. Flowers of unearthly hue swayed in a breeze that did not exist, as if moved by some unseen force, their petals shimmering in the fading light. The very air hummed with life, thick with the aroma of myrrh and the sharp tang of wine. It was a scent that stirred something deep within, something old and familiar, a memory of a time before the fall, before the curse. This was no ordinary garden. This was a place beyond time, a remnant of something ancient and pure, a fragment of Eden itself, untethered from the flow of ages, suspended between the fall of man and the promise of restoration. It was a garden that had not known death or decay, a place where the fruit of life had never been corrupted by sin. As Jesus stood at the entrance of this strange and sacred place, the voice came. It was not loud, but soft, too gentle. A voice that sought to soothe, to tempt, to draw him in. Eat, it whispered, its tone smooth and persuasive. You deserve it. You have journeyed far. You are weary. Take what is offered and rest. The voice was enticing, laced with sweetness. It made promises of pleasure and satisfaction, of relief from the hunger that had gnawed at his body for so long. It seemed like a gift, an offering of comfort and indulgence. Yet, even as he felt the pull of the temptation, something in his spirit remained steadfast. He looked upon the garden, the vines heavy with fruit, the flowers gleaming like jewels in the twilight. And in that moment, he understood. The garden was not what it appeared to be. It was not a gift, but a test, a hollow, fleeting illusion meant to distract, to lead astray. Jesus turned away from the garden, his gaze steady, his heart resolute. For not by bread, nor fruit, nor pleasure am I sustained, he declared, his voice quiet but firm, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. As he spoke, the garden seemed to wither, as if the words themselves had shattered its very essence. The vibrant vines began to curl and shrivel, their fruits turning to dust. The flowers drooped, their colors fading into dull gray. The air, once thick with the heady scent of myrrh and wine, now carried only the faintest trace of sand. Within moments, The illusion had vanished, leaving only the stark reality of the desert behind. The rich, fertile garden, once so full of life, was gone, reduced to nothing more than the dry earth and shifting sands beneath his feet. The beauty, the promise of fulfillment, had been but a fleeting mirage, an empty temptation designed to lead him away from his true purpose. Jesus stood for a moment, his eyes fixed on the barren expanse that now stretched before him. He knew that the garden had been a test, a challenge not of hunger, but of the soul. It had sought to pull him into the false comfort of earthly desires, to make him forget the greater truth he had come to fulfill. But he would not be swayed. He would not turn aside, for he knew that true sustenance came not from the fruits of the earth, but from the Word of God, which was eternal and unchanging. With the garden now faded into the desert's embrace, Jesus continued on his journey. The winds stirred the sand around him, but his spirit remained unmoved. He had faced the temptation of Eden's promise, and had turned from it, choosing instead the path that would lead to true restoration, the path that led through the desert and beyond, toward the fulfillment of the divine plan. And though the garden was gone, its lesson remained, that no matter how tempting the illusions of this world may be, it is only by the Word of God that we are truly nourished. Chapter 12, The Bridge of Bones. By the 30th day, Jesus found himself standing at the edge of a valley unlike any he had seen before. The air was thick with the weight of silence, the kind of silence that only a place steeped in history and sorrow could hold. Before him lay the Valley of Bones. The ground was littered with relics of the past, skulls scattered across the path, their hollow eyes staring into the void as if frozen in time. Spines once strong and proud, arched over cracks and crevices, forming strange, skeletal bridges. The bones of countless warriors, travelers, and dreamers who had tried to walk alone now lay forgotten beneath the burning sun. Each fragment of the past told a story of struggle, of battles fought with pride and passion, only to be lost to time and death. Yet Jesus did not flinch. He did not recoil at the sight of the remains that filled the valley floor. He did not shrink back from the bones of those who had come before him, for he understood what they represented. They were not mere remnants of forgotten lives. They were symbols, lessons etched in bone and dust. The remains of those who had fallen, not from weakness, but from the weight of trying to carry the burdens of the world alone. With reverence, Jesus stepped lightly across the path. He did not tread upon the bones with fear, but with a deep, abiding honor. His feet moved with purpose, each step careful, as though he were walking upon sacred ground. He knew that in each bone, in each skull, there was a prayer, a silent plea for redemption, for understanding. The bones themselves seemed to call out, not in despair, but in quiet hope. As he walked, the voice rose. It was not a human voice, but a sound that seemed to come from the very earth itself. Hollow and mocking, it echoed through the valley, reverberating off the cliffs and the stones. "You too will be dust," the voice hissed, as if to remind him of his own mortality, of the inevitable fate that awaited all flesh. But Jesus did not flinch. He did not fear the mocking voice. He stood tall, his gaze unwavering, his spirit unshaken. "Only the flesh," he replied, his voice calm and steady. "The Spirit is breath, and the breath of God is eternal." At the sound of his words, something miraculous happened. The bones, which had once been still and lifeless, began to stir. Not in the way of the restless dead, not in a haunting, but in something far more profound. They seemed to rise in reverence, responding to the truth that had been spoken. The dry, brittle remains of 1,000 lives began to glow with an ethereal light, a light that radiated from deep within the earth itself. The bones, once scattered and broken, began to come together, not in chaos, but in harmony. One by one, they formed a path, a bridge of light beneath his feet. The valley, once a place of death and decay, became a place of transformation. The very bones of those who had fallen now rose in praise, their fractured and scattered pieces coming together to create a way forward. Jesus walked across the bridge, his steps sure and steady, his heart filled with peace. The bones no longer spoke of death or despair. They spoke of resurrection, of renewal. They spoke of the eternal spirit, which cannot be bound by time or by the decay of the body. The spirit, like the breath of God, was everlasting. And as Jesus passed through the valley of bones, he knew that he was not walking alone. For in this valley, he had seen the truth, that every life, every struggle, every fall was a part of the greater story. The story of the eternal spirit that transcends death, that rises from the ashes of what was and walks forward into what is yet to be. And as he crossed the bridge of light, the bones began to fade, their purpose fulfilled. The valley was empty once more, but the light remained, a reminder that even in the darkest places, even in the depths of death, the Spirit of God is always with us, guiding us toward the eternal truth. Chapter 13, The Tower of Eyes. On the 33rd day, Jesus came upon it, a tower, stretching high into the sky, so vast that it seemed to pierce the very fabric of the heavens. It rose in the desert, dark and monolithic, casting an endless shadow over the land beneath. Its surface was made of obsidian, black and smooth, gleaming in the pale light of the sun. The air around it hummed with a strange energy, as if the tower itself were alive, watching, waiting. As he drew nearer, Jesus saw that the walls of the tower were carved with countless eyes. They were everywhere, eyes of every shape, every size, every kind of being. Some were human, others animal, and some angelic, their wings etched in the stone around their gaze. There were eyes that looked ancient, eyes that seemed to belong to a time long forgotten, eyes that stared into the deepest secrets of the universe. They blinked slowly, constantly, watching him as he approached. Their gaze was unyielding, unblinking, as if they knew everything he had ever done, everything he had ever thought, every hope, every fear. And as he stood before the tower, he realized what it was, the Watcher's Tower. A place where all that was seen was judged, where no secret remained hidden, where every action, every thought, every moment was laid bare. A place where only the gaze of those who watch could determine the worth of a soul. Jesus began to climb the tower, his feet sure and steady upon the cold, smooth stone. With each step, the eyes shifted, their gazes growing sharper, more piercing. As he ascended, new visions flashed before him, visions that took him through time and space. Wars long past, battles fought and lost, betrayals, both personal and universal. The cross, the garden, his own face, tears streaming down his cheeks, a smile breaking through the sorrow, and the agony of death followed by the triumph of resurrection. It was a journey through the very essence of humanity's struggles, triumphs, and failings. Each eye, each vision, was a reflection of the world he had come to save, a world filled with both light and darkness. The tower revealed it all. Nothing was hidden from its gaze. The tower spoke, its voice a deep, resonant echo that seemed to come from all directions at once. See, in despair. It intoned, as if to say that all the suffering, all the sin, all the mistakes of the world were too much to bear. It was a call to surrender, to fall into the depths of hopelessness, to accept that there was no escape from the judgment of the eyes that watched. But Jesus did not flinch. He did not cower before the tower's challenge. Instead, he lifted his gaze to meet the unblinking eyes of the world. "I see," he said, his voice steady and calm, "and I forgive." At his words, something incredible happened. The tower trembled. The stone groaned under the weight of his grace, as if the very foundation of the Watcher's Tower could not withstand the power of forgiveness. The eyes that had watched with judgment began to close, one by one, their lids falling slowly over the stones like a curtain drawn over the stage of a great play. The weight of their gaze faded, and the tower, once full of judgment and despair, began to crack. The obsidian surface splintered, sending shards of stone falling into the abyss below. When Jesus reached the summit, He stood alone, high above the desert, the wind whispering through the air. All the eyes of the tower had closed, not in blindness, not in death, but in peace. The judgments had ceased. The vision of the world's failings had been replaced by the stillness of grace. And in that moment, as the tower crumbled behind him, Jesus knew that he had overcome the world's gaze. For he had seen it all, and yet he chose forgiveness over judgment, light over darkness, love over despair. The tower had no power over him, for he had brought with him the truth that even the harshest eyes could not resist, the truth of love, of redemption, of mercy. And as the last of the eyes closed, the silence that followed was not one of emptiness, but of peace. A peace that surpassed understanding, that filled the vastness of the sky and the endlessness of the desert. A peace that would remain long after the tower had fallen to dust. Chapter 14. The Song in the Fire. On the 36th night, the desert was set ablaze. But this was no ordinary fire. The flames did not burn with wrath or destruction, but with revelation. Each flicker a promise, each spark a truth waiting to be unearthed. Fire fell from the heavens, not as a fury to scorch the earth, but as a purifier, a beacon. It danced in spirals around him, swarming in patterns that defied logic and language, forming symbols too ancient to be known by any tongue, too sacred for any scroll to contain. These symbols spun in the flames, hinting at something that had existed long before time began. Within the fire, a voice rose, deep and timeless, as though it had been speaking from the very core of creation itself. It was not the voice of the serpent, nor the shadowed king, nor the whisper of temptation that had tried to sway him before. This was something far older, something primal, rooted in the beginning of all things. "I'm the hunger of the stars," it said, its voice a strange melody that echoed across the endless stretch of desert. "I am the longing of the fallen, the silence of heaven before the first word." The voice vibrated in the air like the hum of a distant cosmic wind, as though it was calling out from the space between worlds, from the silent moments before the dawn of existence. It spoke of desires and needs that had never been named, of yearnings that stretched beyond the confines of time and space. It spoke of a deep, ancient silence, a silence that had waited for the word to break it. Jesus stood still, his feet rooted to the earth beneath him, his gaze fixed upon the fire. He could feel its heat, yet it did not burn him. Instead, he felt its warmth as a revelation, its light as a guiding force. He understood that the fire did not seek to consume him, but to transform him, to draw forth the essence of all that he was. And in that moment, he answered, not with words of challenge, not with pride or defiance, but with a simple declaration that came from the very core of his being. "Then hear my voice." He stepped into the fire. The flames rose around him like a living thing, twisting and curling in intricate patterns, but they did not scorch him. They parted before him, as if they recognized the presence of the Word made flesh. There was no pain, no burning, no sense of being consumed. Instead, there was only the profound sound of something ancient, something that had been waiting for him all along. The fire began to sing. It sang not of destruction, nor of wrath, nor of any earthly song. It sang his name, not as man, not as martyr, not as the one who would endure suffering, but as the Word. It sang of the divine truth that had existed from the very beginning, the truth that had come to life in him. The flames swirled around him, not as an inferno, but as a chorus of creation itself, affirming his identity and his purpose. In the dance of fire, in the song of the flame, Jesus was both the singer and the song. The fire recognized him, not as the one who walked the earth, but as the eternal Word, the force of creation that had called forth the universe, the silence, and the longing. The fire bowed to him, not in submission, but in reverence, acknowledging the divine presence that stood in its midst. And as the fire swirled and sang, something else occurred. The stars in the sky, those distant, silent lights that had watched over the desert for millennia, began to weep. Their tears fell like rain, soft and luminous, streaking across the heavens as if they, too, were caught in the song of the fire, swept away by the eternal truth that Jesus carried within him. The night seemed to hold its breath. The desert, the heavens, and the fire were all silent witnesses to this moment, this meeting of the eternal and the mortal. And in the midst of it all, Jesus stood, unburned, unbroken, as the fire sang his name. It was not the fire that had consumed him. It was he who had awakened the fire, and in turn, the fire had awakened the stars, the earth, and all that existed. The song continued, echoing through the desert and beyond, until the fire itself began to fade, leaving only the memory of its light, the warmth of its song, and the stillness that followed. And in that stillness, the stars no longer wept. They had heard the song. They had witnessed the truth. And now, they knew, the hunger of the stars, the longing of the fallen, the silence before the first word, had all been fulfilled. For he, the Word made flesh, had come. And in that coming, the fire had found its purpose, and the stars had found their song. Chapter 15, The Empty Throne. On the 40th day, Jesus reached the heart of the desert, the place where the land seemed to bleed into the sky, where all paths converged and all stories found their end. He had wandered for days without a clear direction, led only by the certainty of his purpose and the whispers of the wind. Now, before him, atop a vast dune that rose like a mountain and touched the very veil of heaven, stood a throne. The throne was not made of marble, nor gold, nor any material of earth. It was crafted of pure light, shaped with the elegance of authority, yet held no adornment, no crowns, no treasures to beckon the flesh. It gleamed with the quiet radiance of something eternal, something that existed beyond the trappings of worldly power. And there it stood alone. The throne was empty. For a long moment, Jesus gazed at it. There was no temptation in the sight, no longing for its empty grandeur. He had known this moment would come, the offer of dominion without struggle, of rule without sacrifice. But as he stood before it, he felt only a deep sorrow, a sadness that seemed to hang in the air like the last breath of a dying star. Then the voice spoke again, the same voice that had whispered in his ear since the beginning of his journey, offering false promises and tempting his resolve. It spoke softly, almost tenderly, as though it knew the weight of the choice that lay before him. You could sit, it said, its tone sweet and persuasive. You could rule. All could be yours, without cross, without pain, without sacrifice. All of it without suffering. The world could bend at your feet, and all would be yours. The wind shifted as though holding its breath, and for a fleeting moment, the desert seemed to stand still in the face of this unspoken offer. But Jesus did not waver. His eyes, though weary from the journey, shone with the same clarity and conviction that had guided him through the wilderness. He knew what he had come for. He knew what he must do. With tears gathering in his eyes, he stepped forward and gently whispered, "I did not come to sit. I came to serve." His words were not defiant. They were not born of pride or arrogance. They were simply the truth, soft, humble, and firm in its simplicity. He was not meant to sit upon a throne of gold or to rule by power. He had come to serve, to lift others up, to show the way through love, through sacrifice, through the strength of a spirit unbroken. Turning away from the empty throne, he left the glittering illusions of power behind. He walked into the vastness of the desert, his heart full of purpose, his spirit at peace. The throne remained untouched, empty, as it had always been. And then, something remarkable happened. The wind that had once tried to tempt him, the wind that had whispered promises of ease and glory, now blew in reverence. It moved with a gentle touch, as though it, too, recognized the truth he had embraced. The desert, once harsh and unyielding, now seemed to soften around him, as if the very earth bowed to his choice. Above, the heavens opened, the sky parted, and from the vast expanse, the Spirit descended once more. It came not as a force of power or a storm of might, but as a gentle breeze that caressed his skin, filling him with a presence more profound than anything he had known. The Spirit came to affirm the truth he had chosen, that he had come not to rule, but to love, not to sit upon a throne, but to serve. And as the Spirit descended, there was no more need for words. The heavens spoke without speaking, the earth beneath his feet sang without sound. All things, seen and unseen, bore witness to his decision. He had turned away from a throne of light, and in doing so, he had ascended to the highest throne of all, the throne of the heart, the throne of selfless love, the throne that could never be emptied. In that moment, the desert no longer felt empty. It was full of grace, full of purpose, full of the quiet reverence that comes when the soul chooses to walk the path of truth, no matter the cost. And so, the wind that had once tempted now blew in honor. The heavens opened, and the Spirit descended, enveloping him in light, in peace, in the fulfillment of all that had been promised. He had not come to sit. He had come to serve. And in that service, he had fulfilled the highest calling of all. Epilogue: the return of the light. The desert lay still. The stones, once sharp and testing, now hummed to quiet him. The winds, once howling with doubt and accusation, now carried only the scent of dawn.